Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And really welcome our friends from afar, from Friends of Socialist China. And it's such a great pleasure to welcome Friends of Socialist China delegation to the China Institute on the occasion of the 120th anniversary of Fudan University and the 10th anniversary of the China Institute. Indeed, with 75 years of socialist construction, China has become the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity since 2014. And today, China is the largest industrial, manufacturing, and trading nation, with the world's largest middle class and extreme poverty eradicated, and life expectancy 2 years higher than the United States. Furthermore, thanks to Chinese socialism, at the speed of accomplishing almost one industrial revolution every decade since the early 1980s, China is now at the forefrontier of the new industrial revolution with big data, AI, and quantum technologies, and more. And now the only country capable of providing goods, services, and experience from all the four industrial revolutions to the whole world. All this has changed China and the world forever. Yet, it's also true that China remains controversial for one reason or another, especially in the West, and even among the left in the West. Amazing. And this is the reason why our dialogue today is so important and meaningful, not only for ourselves, but also beyond. So I'm thinking of arranging our dialogue this afternoon in the following way. In the first part, Professor Wu, my colleague, Chinese philosopher of Marxism, and I, together with Comrade Keith Bennett and Comrade Carlos Martinez, we four will have a dialogue, maybe for maximum half an hour, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour. Then we'll open the floor to everyone. Please raise as many questions as you want, no taboo whatsoever. So, without much ado, let me first invite Carlos to say a few words before our dialogue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks so much to Fudan University, to the China Institute, to Chris and the other organizers of today's event. It's a great honor to be invited here. So thanks on behalf of myself, but also Friends of Socialist China. And thanks in particular to Professor Zhang Weiwei for inviting us. I think, Zhang Weiwei, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most important voices inside China, attempting to explain the reality of China and tell the truth of China, particularly to a Western and to an English-speaking audience. And his books that are published in English, The China Wave, The China Horizon, are categorized as must-read books. I would strongly encourage people to read them if they haven't done so already. And in terms of my own intellectual journey, understanding China's history, its politics, its culture, its traditions, its mindset were quite formative, quite foundational to me. So thank you very much again for inviting us. It's a great honor. I wanted to say a few words about my book, which is called The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century, a book which was written between 2021 and 2023 and then published in 2023. And I wanted to provide some sort of justification for having written it, because there's lots of books that are written about China that can be purchased in the West. And if you look at the Amazon bestsellers list for books about China, you'll find titles such as China's New Tyranny, or How China Took Over the World While America's Elite Slept, or Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World. So there's a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of presenting negative portrayals of China. And I wanted to enter into a slightly less crowded marketplace and firstly present China's successes, because, as I said, there's lots of negative stories that are told about China, but there's nothing said about some very important successes of Chinese socialism, most obviously in terms of poverty alleviation, and what the United Nations describes as the most successful and the most wide-ranging poverty alleviation program in history. According to World Bank figures, that famous Marxist organization, the World Bank, China has lifted 800 million people from poverty in the last 40 years. 100 million of those in the last 10 or 12 years alone, with the launch of the targeted poverty alleviation campaign, when literally millions of cadres were sent into the countryside to identify those individuals, those families, those communities living in poverty, and to work with them to find a route out of poverty, a sustainable route out of poverty. So they moved out of poverty and they stayed out of poverty. And the result of that is that as of 2021, and the centenary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, out of China's population of 1.4 billion people, there are 0 people living in extreme poverty. And that doesn't just mean that they're above the internationally defined threshold of $2.10 per day of cash income. It also means a guarantee of dignified housing, a guarantee of nutritious food, a guarantee of decent clothing, a guarantee of clean water piped into your home, a guarantee of electricity piped into your home, a guarantee that your children go to school for at least 10 years, and a guarantee that if you get sick, you see a doctor. So according to this definition of being out of poverty, then to be just above that threshold in China, anywhere else in most of the global south, most of the third world, most of the developing world, is to be essentially middle class. Certainly to be where my father comes from in India, if you've got food on the table and a roof over your head and you're not in debt bondage and your children go to school, then you're effectively middle income, middle class. The other very important thing that doesn't get talked about in the West in relation to China's successes is the fact that China is the only renewable energy superpower in the world. China is responsible for 60% of all wind power production and all solar power production in the world. And that's coming from almost nothing 15 or 20 years ago. 98% of the world's electric buses are manufactured in China. 70% of the world's high-speed rail is found here in China. 2/3 of the world's electric vehicles are here in China. China's the world leader in biodiversity protection, in forestation, and in pollution reduction. So these are extraordinary successes, world-shaking, unprecedented successes that I think people in the West should know about if they're going to have a realistic and a balanced understanding of contemporary China. And it's also very important to mention that this has been in the context of China's peaceful rise, a consistently peaceful foreign policy. China hasn't been at war in over 4 decades, at a time when the United States has been constantly at war, be it in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and now, of course, waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. The United States has 800 overseas military bases. China has 1 in Djibouti to protect shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean. The United States has around 5,500 nuclear warheads. China has around 500. And furthermore, China is the only nuclear power to have a consistent policy of no first use. It's literally written into China's constitution that China would never use nuclear weapons except in retaliation for a nuclear strike against it. And that policy has been in place since China's first successful nuclear test in 1964. One can compare China's response to the crisis, to the genocide in Gaza, with that of the United States. China, from the very beginning, from October 2023, has called for a unilateral, immediate, and comprehensive ceasefire and withdrawal of Israeli troops. Meanwhile, the United States has been providing the weapons with which this genocide is being waged, it's been providing the money with which this genocide is being waged, and it's been providing the diplomatic cover for this genocide. Similarly, in Ukraine, the US and its allies in the West, in Western Europe in particular, have been pouring fuel onto the fire in the hope of fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, whereas China has been working with the African Union, China has been working with Brazil to try and bring about a negotiated diplomatic, peaceful solution that meets the legitimate security interests of all parties concerned. So, essentially this means presenting China as a partner on humanity's overall journey towards a more prosperous, a more peaceful, and a more sustainable future. Connected to that, with the book, I wanted to clear up some misconceptions and misunderstandings of China, debunk some myths, and counter the propaganda war. So many people in the West are led to believe through the media, through the education system, that China is engaged in a genocide or a cultural genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, or that China is a climate criminal, or that China's trapping the countries of Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific in debt traps, or that China's spying on the West, that it's trying to undermine our democracy and all the rest of it. And this creates a sort of anti-China sentiment which serves to justify and build public support for Western governments' anti-China positioning and aggression, be that in the form of Cold War measures such as tariffs or a chip war or a crackdown on Huawei or TikTok or attacks on Chinese scientists and researchers and students in the West and particularly the US, or in the form of hot war measures and an escalating campaign of containment and encirclement of China, including 300 US military bases in the Pacific region, including the deployment of literally hundreds of thousands of US troops in South Korea, in Japan, in Okinawa, in Guam, in Australia, in the Philippines, the creation of the AUKUS trilateral nuclear pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, the revival of the quadrilateral security dialogue, and so on. So what I tried to put forward in the book is that Cold War on China and potential hot war on China are disastrous for humanity at a point in our journey as human beings where we desperately need peace, we desperately need peaceful, mutually beneficial cooperation on climate change, on pandemics, on global development and modernization. And the third and final real key tenet of this book is to deal with some misunderstandings of China's social system. There's almost a consensus in the West, and Professor Zhang alluded to this in his introduction, that China has become a capitalist country. The only division is to whether that's a good or a bad thing. You have right-wingers who think that, well, China was socialist for 30 years, from 1949 until 1978, and it was a disaster, and it was a basket case country, and then they adopted capitalism from the third plenum in 1978, and then things have been better since then. Of course, this is nothing like a credible or viable narrative, because it doesn't explain why, of all the capitalist countries in the global south, of all the capitalist developing countries, it's only China that has succeeded to the extent that it has done. It doesn't explain why India hasn't succeeded to that extent. India is a very similar country in terms of size, in terms of location, in terms of history. India won its independence in 1947. China won its liberation in 1949. And India's been a capitalist country from the start. India's had a 30-year head start on China. So if capitalism is the magic ingredient for success, then India should be far ahead of where China is. But the simple fact is that India's economy is about 4 or 5 times smaller than that of China, and there's hundreds of millions of people living in India that don't have access to a dignified housing or nutritious food or modern energy, and their children don't go to school. And the life expectancy in India is about 10 years lower than it is in China. So we can throw this right-wing narrative out without any problems. And then there are elements of the left, and you could say the ultra-left, that say, well, China was socialist, and then it went capitalist, and that's a bad thing because it used to be the most equal country in the world, and now it's highly unequal, and there's the penetration of global capitalist brands. I'm sure I wouldn't have to walk very far from the gates of Fudan University to find a branch of Starbucks or McDonald's. This is really a kind of highly ideological and dogmatic narrative that ignores these successes, that thinks that lifting 800 million people out of poverty isn't particularly important, and preventing the world from climate catastrophe isn't terribly important. So I try to explain China's successes as a function of its socialism, as a function of the location of political power in the people and particularly the working class and the peasantry. Hence the title, The East is Still Red. You know, the East was red and it's still red. And what I contend is that if decisions were made on behalf of a capitalist class, if decisions were made on behalf of people who own and deploy capital, and if resources were allocated on that basis, there's no way that China would have prioritized poverty alleviation to the extent that it has done. There's no way that China would prioritize improving people's living standards, especially those at the very bottom of society, in the way that it has done. There's no way that it would have prioritized development of renewable energy to the degree that it has. There's no way that it would have dealt with COVID-19 pandemic so successfully and have massively prioritized the preservation and protection of human life. There's no way that it would have deployed infrastructure throughout the country. You know, we've just been in Jiayuguan, formerly a very poor, very small city in Gansu, which is incredibly modern. You know, it's at a level of modernity that surpasses most big cities in the West. It's a quite incredible thing, as well as being green and clean and obviously having a very good quality of life. So in capitalism, in Western societies, there's a direct correlation between wealth and power that doesn't exist in China. And my view is that if we're socialists, if we're Marxists, if we uphold socialism as a better path for humanity, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to ascribe China's successes to capitalism. So, you know, in summary, with the book, I've tried to build some understanding of China, to build solidarity with China, to learn from China, and hopefully make some small contribution to people-to-people links. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, for your very inspiring opening remarks. And indeed, the very title of your book, The East is Still Red, and then Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. And for a Chinese reading this very title, two things catch my eye. One is you have explained, still, as I said, China remains controversial, even among the left in the West. So you try to explain China is still socialist. Now, even this very word, Chinese socialism, within China, this is something, you know, amazing, you know. Let me share you the anecdote, because we compiled the book in 2017. Originally, I edited this book, 5 scholars, 6 scholars from this institute. We call it Chinese socialism. Yet, we thought everything goes well. But in the end, the editor from the publishing house in Shanghai said, it must be socialism with Chinese characteristics. But that's the very thing we want to break through. We want to say Chinese socialism. Yeah. Because when you say socialism with Chinese characteristics, it's for domestic consumption. It's for internal audience, readers. But within the Chinese socialism, by the time 2017, it's already appealing to many other peoples in the world. So this is something, you know, insider story, which many of you did not know. The Chinese, the state has always been very modest. And we don't want to give people the impression that we want to promote Chinese model to outside world. This is entirely only for China, suitable for China, good or bad. Yeah. But we say, let's do something, you know, original, and we use the title. In the first place, one editor, another editor, all goes well. And then the last one, senior one. So, oh no, this is something entirely new. We must say social with Chinese characteristics. Yet we have a compromise. In the end, we keep most of Chinese socialism within the book. But the very title still with Chinese characteristics. So that's Chinese compromise and flexibility. Yet this idea Chinese socialism now is used more and more often within China. Now, following from your conversation, I want to discuss a very interesting idea, or my thought on this very issue. Back in 2017, I was invited by the China Forum in Yale University, University of Yale. And I gave a presentation. Then during the Q&A session, one professor asked, Chinese system is a state capitalism. And when you are going to abandon state capitalism? I said, no. Chinese system is socialist. I said, in many ways, Chinese socialism saved American capitalism in the financial tsunami, 2008. And I said, from my own research, another crisis may on the way. I hope next time you'll not come to Chinese socialism. American capitalism, you yourself try to handle the coming crisis.
Yes.
Yeah, then I explained 3 reasons why Chinese is socialist. China is a socialist state. I said, first, public ownership is predominant. There is an evolution. At the time of beginning of the reforms in the 1980s, this public ownership usually refers to the state-owned enterprises, which is predominant. At that time, foreign direct investment represents less than 5% of China's GDP. By the time of Jiang Zemin, which means 1999, 2000, he made a very important ideological modification. He said, let's go beyond this state-owned enterprises. So at that time, China adopted reform initiatives. It's called the 抓大放小, grasp the big ones and let loose the small ones, which means the big ones, those state-owned enterprises in key sectors, telecommunications, defense industry, and more, are in the hands of the state ownership. But for the others, the small, medium-sized enterprises, they are either privatized or whatever, marketized. So that would. And then there is a change in the government work report, which says public ownership today means not only or not confined to state ownership of means of production or state-owned enterprises, but also refers to the state ownership of land and strategic resources. So when the Western Journal, Western media were talking about the China's debt crisis, government debt, whatever, I said, don't worry, because China's a socialist country. The state, central government has a tremendous reputation and prestige, so you can issue bonds. That's what we're doing today. It's totally different from the American economic system. And the second is there is a balance between political power, social power, and capital power in favor of the most of the Chinese population. This is important. In other words, most Chinese are beneficiaries from the globalization. So China is arguably one of the very few countries, very few complaints about globalization. There are critiques, but not the mainstream views. Because most ordinary people began to improve their living standards in the process of globalization after joining WTO. In other words, we have made best use of whatever liberal Western United States dominated globalization. Yet we've also made best to resist and reduce whatever defects it may have. In Chinese words, it's called the 趋利避害, maximize the good, minimize the bad, something this approach. And so this balance is in favor of most population. And number 3, China has the, I call, holistic interest political party, which is the Chinese Communist Party. And this is very different from Western-style political parties, which are partisan parties or partial interest parties. And some people say, well, this is just for the sake of argument. No, it's something very serious because, as I said, China's civilizational state, it is a country, it's an amalgamation of hundreds of states into one of its long history. Yeah, you went to Jiayuguan, at that time, over there it was a state. Shanghai, Zhejiang, Gansu, they all belong to different states in China's long history. Yeah. And then with this amalgamation of hundreds of states into one, China was first unified in 221 BC. And from then on, China was in most of cases, China was always governed by what I call unified ruling entity. And behind the unified ruling entity was a system, what I call meritocracy, or selection plus election. In other words, if you become today a member of political bureau, especially the standing committee, top 7 leaders, you must have already governed, 1, 2, 3 provinces. You have already governed 100 million people before you come to this top echelon of the leadership. It's extreme meritocracy-based, extremely competent, extremely competitive. So I think this is, I said, as a result, China is socialist, not capitalist, not state capitalism. So I just make this additional remark, which I'm pretty sure Carlos will reflect in his new edition of this book. Thank you. Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I'm told I'm supposed to use this, I think. It's quite difficult to choose a few words because I think Carlos, if I can say so, made a really brilliant contribution and introduction, and so many of the points that need to be made were made by Carlos, and I don't propose to repeat them. But I'd like to follow on from a couple of the points that were made. I was very interested to hear Professor Zhang refer to the not only the economic changes that took place in the period of Jiang Zemin's leadership, but also the theoretical understanding that was put forward at that time. And if I remember the relevant political report to the party congress that Jiang Zemin delivered, if I remember it correctly, building on what Professor Zhang said, one of the important theoretical innovations, in my view, that Jiang Zemin spelled out was that in defining the nature of China as a socialist country, albeit as was particularly stressed at that time, a country in the primary stage of socialism, was the fact that the state, in defining what was the socialist sector of the economy and why was it predominant, one had to look not only at the state-owned enterprises, not only at public ownership of land, but also at the cooperative sector, which was distinguished from private capitalist ownership. And I think that's something very important, whether you're going down to the township and village enterprise level or to large organizations like Huawei, which is in fact a cooperative, and also the state-owned sectors, shares within joint ventures, joint stock enterprises, and the fact that the socialist sector could be reflected in all sorts of ways outside of wholesale ownership, be it majority shareholding or golden shares or regulatory bodies and so on. And I think we see this intensifying in the continuing reform of China, where this may be a little controversial, and obviously it's a work in progress. But to an extent, you can say in China that the distinction between private and public enterprise is starting to lessen in that one of the things that we see in the new era under General Secretary Xi Jinping is the role, the enhanced role of party committees, workers' congresses, and so on within the private sector as well, which means that the private sector is free to develop in China, but it has to serve the overall interests of the state and society and the majority of the people. I'm, of course, not talking about a coffee shop or a barber shop or something like that, but when one's talking about major private enterprises as exist in China, they not only exist, but they can thrive, but within the context that they actually serve the state, the nation, and the people. And I think that is something that a capitalist society cannot do. And if we understand, as we should, that socialism is a transitional society on the way that becomes more and more developed towards the direction of communist society, the question is actually who is being served in that process. And we have experience in Britain and from 1945 onwards, large swathes of the British economy were nationalised, but they were never placed in the service of the working class or the mass of the people, and the working class and the mass of people had no say in their direction. So it becomes, as Professor Zhang was saying, that it is the political factor that is primary, and the economy has to be placed in the service of that, whatever form it takes. The other thing I wanted to say was when Professor Zhang was talking about his book, which the polemic, the discussion over the title amused me somewhat, having had a little bit of dealings with Chinese publishers or Chinese editors, that they tend, I think, to be quite conservative. And one of the things that is interesting is that Chinese political thought has to be translated into foreign languages. But then once it's translated, it still needs another process of translation, because there is all sorts of terminology that makes perfect sense in China, whether it's because of the debates that have gone on in the party and in the country that have led up to that formulation, or because you're using formulations that in Chinese culture go back thousands of years. So any person in China will know what those mean. A foreign reader doesn't necessarily. And that's one of the reasons why we started Friends of Socialist China 4 years ago, and why delegations like this are so important for us. Because as Professor Zhang said right at the beginning, even on the left, China is controversial. And it's that controversy and that confusion that we've sought to address, and we are seeking to address in Friends of Socialist China, so that people in the progressive movement on the left, in the communist movement, the trade unions, mass organizations, and so on, can start to understand China and Chinese socialism better, not only because we want to support and defend China, which we do, but because it's actually important for us. Because if we don't understand what's happening in China, we don't understand what's happening in the world, and we can't find a way forward. And that's where I think that discussion about socialism with Chinese characteristics and Chinese socialism has importance on that level as well, in that, as is often said in Marxism, that quantitative increase gives rise to qualitative change. So socialism with Chinese characteristics is a term that emerged when the Chinese people rightly decided that they had to take the universal principles of socialism and of Marxism, but to put them into a Chinese language, to suit the reality of China, to be explained in the way that Chinese people could understand. But in so doing, through that process of development, it gets to a stage where I think it's more and more relevant to talk about Chinese socialism when one's projecting it to the world, not because Chinese socialism as it exists in China is a template to be imposed or mechanically copied in any other country, but because it has contributed to the collective wisdom, a collective knowledge, collective theory of the international working class and people throughout the world. And I think this is exactly what, and the turning point in putting this forward, I think historically will be seen in what General Secretary Xi Jinping said in his political report to the 19th Congress, and he repeated it in his political report to the 20th Congress, namely that socialism with Chinese characteristics offers a new frame of reference for any country or people that seeks to rapidly develop its economy while maintaining its independence. And I think this is what is being rolled out by China, by the leadership of China and President Xi in the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and so on. And just to conclude, with Carlos ran through some of the titles of ridiculous books, about one of which was How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World While America Sleeps, and so on. I mean, I've read those books. They're sort of great, if you like, comic-like reading, particularly when they refer to organisations that you're involved with, as that one does in my case. But there's an element of truth in this, that yes, the Communist Party of China is reshaping the world, not in a malign or a conspiratorial way, but the People's Republic of China, led by the Communist Party, is the only country in the world that is putting forward practical, realistic questions relating to the existential issues that face humanity, and is proposing a way out and a way forward that can be acceptable to the overwhelming majority of countries of the world and are in the interests of the people in every country of the world. And as Deng Xiaoping said in, I think, November 1989 to Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, obviously at that time socialism was collapsing in Eastern Europe and so on, and Deng Xiaoping said that so long as socialism can hold its grounds in China, so long as socialism can be maintained in China, it will always be able to hold its head high in the world. And I think the veracity of that statement has been proved increasingly over the decades, and is doing so with each passing day. Thanks.
Would you like to say a few words, Professor Wu? Yeah.
Okay. I think it's very interesting that the term problem. I also prefer to use the term Chinese socialism. Yeah, I think this is a better term than socialism with Chinese characteristics, because I think the Chinese socialism has a kind of universal dimension, while the socialism with Chinese characteristics maybe focus more on the particular dimension. Because I think as a Marxist, maybe the ideal is human emancipation. So maybe right now we need to develop the universal dimension of Chinese socialism. What can China contribute to the world? So I think this is a very serious problem. Yeah. The other point is that when the Communist Party put forward the term socialism with Chinese characteristics, I think it embodied some kind of defensive position, which means our socialism is not the kind of Soviet Union socialism or the East European socialism. Our socialism with our China characteristics. So the focus is on the Chinese characteristics I think this is very conservative and defensive. So, but right now we need to develop it further to express our great plan or ambitions. Yeah, I think it's necessary. I would like to follow Professor Zhang's question about the state capitalism. Why we could understand China as a socialism rather than state capitalism? I think maybe we first need to understand the role of Communist Party in China's economic development and economic life. I think China is the greatest policy maker in China is the Communist Party. Yeah. The fundamental economic policy is made by Communist Party rather than by some capitalists or some other interest groups. I think this is very important. Thank you.
Just one additional remark following from Professor Wu's comment. In fact, if you follow the evolution of Chinese political narrative, the official narratives, there's also another change which has to do with this. For many years, we talk about modernization with Chinese characteristics, or socialist modernization with Chinese characteristics. But since a few years ago, Xi Jinping said, Chinese modernization. Yeah. So this is different. The first expression is more for domestic reasons. And when we say Chinese modernization, which means we compare this with Swedish socialism, with American modernization, with European modernization. I made an analogy, if we sell the Chinese bullet train, high-speed train, if we say this is a train with Chinese characteristics, that's for Chinese domestic consumption. But we say this is a Chinese bullet train, this is a German bullet train, this is a French one, and this is a Japanese one. So you can make comparisons. As Xi Jinping said, it offers one alternative for those who are interested. But we do not impose this model on others. We never do that. So Carlos, one question for you is, since the publication for your great book, to what extent this controversy about China among the left has changed?
Yeah, well, there's a few aspects to that. I also must, just to come back to one thing you said about how Chinese socialism saved US capitalism. I don't think you should expect our comrades from the United States here to thank you for that, because they're trying to dismantle US capitalism. It's quite unfortunate. In the hotel we're staying at in Shanghai at the moment, one of the pictures on the wall is of Tony Blair in Shanghai. And Keith, as you know, has been working closely with China and connected to China for many, many decades. So I asked him, what was the Blair government's relationship with China like, or its approach to China like? And Keith said, well, actually, it was quite good. And the same is the case with the Gordon Brown government that followed it. And the same was the case with the David Cameron government that followed that. And it was actually under David Cameron's premiership that the Britain and China created the so-called golden era of UK-China relations. President Xi Jinping came to Britain on a state visit, met the Queen, met the Prime Minister, also met the then leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, who is known to many of us and friendly with many of us. And there was a huge amount of trade between the UK and China. There was huge investment encouraged by the British government by China in Britain. And since the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House, and especially since the launch of the trade war in 2018, combined with the Brexit vote in Britain, which increased the British ruling class's reliance on the United States and the importance of this UK-US special relationship, relations between Britain and China have been deteriorating quite significantly, and the level of hostility towards China, especially in the media and in government circles, has been rising. So the overall environment has become more anti-China. I would say on the left, the situation is improving. There's a number of factors to that. There's a subjective factor, and without wanting to be arrogant or wanting to exaggerate, I think the work that Friends of Socialist China and other individuals and groups are doing has been increasingly effective and starting to have some impact. The other thing is the objective factor, that in spite of the attempts of our media to hide the positive things that are happening in China, certain things can't be hidden. So, for example, I mentioned about China's progress in renewable energy, the fact that China is a renewable energy superpower, the only renewable energy superpower. All progressive people in the West care about that. So if you're someone who wants to avoid climate breakdown, if you're someone that wants to see massive decarbonization of our energy systems worldwide, you can't ignore the fact that China is responsible for 60% of all renewable energy. And that's probably a number that's likely to go up in the coming years. So are people really going to, when China's responsible for 80% of all renewable energy, and when China's getting close to meeting its goal of zero emissions by 2060, are environmentalists and progressive people going to be able to ignore China's contribution, China's positive contributions? And then in relation to foreign policy, I mentioned the situation in Gaza. For years, since the 2016, 2017, the media have been flooding our inboxes and our newspapers with stories about, as I mentioned, a supposed genocide or a cultural genocide in Xinjiang. Meanwhile, people can see on their mobile phones, on TikTok or on YouTube, an actual genocide taking place in Gaza, and their government is telling them that it's not a genocide, the media is telling them that it's not a genocide. So you don't actually have to be hyper-intelligent to realize that there's some serious cognitive dissonance here, and that the media must be lying to us. And I think the situation in in Gaza has really impacted people's understanding and affected their trust in their media, and has made them think, well, if these people are lying to us about what's going on in Gaza, they're probably lying to us about what's going on in China, and they're probably lying to us about what's going on in Ukraine. And on that basis, I think people are increasingly open to hearing the truth about China.
Yes, I follow your comment. Make brief a few comments here. For so many years, this fanfare about the Green Deal, energy transition, is almost a monopoly of the European NGOs, social, whatever, political discourse. Yet, if you look at the performance, China is the only country, such a large economy, who has done it. Green transition completed. Renewable energy is now less costly in China than traditional conventional energies. It is the result of at least 4 5-year plans, 20 years. So I was invited to Sciences Po in Paris this February. I made this case. I said, if you compare the Chinese system and the European, whatever political system, can your system deliver that? 20 years consistency and have something done completely. It's so great for mankind, for climate change, for everything, so positive. So that's one example. The Chinese socialism is better than Western capitalism, because only socialism can do that, to be honest. We need a holistic interest party to plan and have the plan executed. And it's 4 5-year plans, at least. Second thing is Keith mentioned the Jiang Zemin's era. At that time, he also made a remark about what's called the three represents. Chinese Communist Party should represent advanced productive force. This means the best in sciences, the new scientific high-tech revolution, and advanced culture and interests of the most of the people. So this very first represents most advanced productivity, has to do with China's progress in science, in IT, etc., deep seek, whatever. A good example is, again, to compare with Europe. You know, when Donald Trump began its trade war and tariff war and tech war against China, it had to do with China's famous plan called Made in China 2025. In fact, China drew this plan after Germany did something similar. Germany produced a plan called Made in, and it's called the German Industry 4.0. It's about the intelligence economy. Everything should be controlled by AI, robots, etc. And China was tremendously inspired by the German plan and said we should do something similar. So we produced a plan, Made in China 2025. Now, Chinese plan, done, completed. German plan in shatters. No one remembers. No one remembers. Reason is very simple, because you have to represent the productive force. The German Chancellor, what's his name, after Merkel, you know, Scholz, follow the American approach, ban Huawei 5G technologies, and dismantled those even already equipped. Very stupid, because intelligent economy depends on 5G. It has to be what's called the linkage of everything, you know, not mobile phone, but also your car, everything with one operation system and connected in no time delay. So when Germany decided to abandon Huawei, we know that plan. That's German Industry 4.0. Will become zero. No plan. So again, this is something, whether you have this idea of forward planning and representing the most productive, advanced productivity. As for Xinjiang, you know, I know this Western propaganda try to smear China and smear Xinjiang, but we are in China. And even among those who are most critical of Chinese government within China, can't imagine Chinese government will carry out genocide. That is ridiculous to the extreme, or stupidity to the extreme. I often display these video clips from BBC, from whatever, in my class. People laugh to the tears, you know. Obvious, so exaggerated, to such extent, fabrications. And as a result, BBC, CNN, this mainstream, you know, liberal, whatever, media, all of a sudden, you know, lost their credibility within China, beginning from that particular year. Even when every year Xinjiang received more than 100 million or 200 million tourists, they are still spreading this kind of lies, you know. Just one good example is not a single Islamic country in the UN criticize China for that. So our friend, former Singaporean Foreign Minister George Yu said, United States is not particularly known to love Muslims, but they love Chinese Muslims. So just additional to your comment. Maybe should we open the floor, and you can raise any questions to anyone. We have a free discussion. Yeah. You have a comment to make, please.
Not comment. I just want to ask some
yes.
question to
for Carlos.
To comrade, for the comrade Carlos. My first question is that you said in your book that the imperialist West has launched a new Cold War on socialist China. How do you think of the possible consequences of this plan? And the second question is about the future of socialism. My understanding is that the socialism is a worldwide business or worldwide mission. And, could you please introduce some new development of socialist movement in Western Europe, in Europe or Latin America? Yeah, the new development of socialist movement. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Quite big questions, and maybe partly these questions could be opened out to the audience members as well. Just to briefly comment on these, what are the potential consequences of a new Cold War? I mean, in terms of the Cold War measures with the semiconductor war, the tariff war, the trade war, and the propaganda war, these are obviously designed to encourage a level of decoupling. So they're designed to isolate China from the world. And as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the purpose of the propaganda war is to create war propaganda against China to win public support for anti-China hostility, anti-China aggressions, be that in the form of a Cold War or a hot war. So one significant danger of Cold War tensions is that they escalate and get out of control and turn into a physical war between two nuclear powers, and if we're talking about the United States and China. The other problem, and I think we're increasingly seeing this manifest itself in reality, is that these Cold War measures are not working. They're unsuccessful. It's actually a case of too little, too late. We can see what's happened, just in the last 2 months with the tariff war. The Trump administration ended up imposing 145% tariffs on China, which essentially is a way of saying we're not going to do business with China, we're not going to trade with China. And China's government held completely firm, retaliated, matched the Americans tariff for tariff, and the result is that it was the US that blinked first. It's the US that's had to back down. The purpose of these tariffs was to bully China, to blackmail China into buying trillions of dollars worth of US manufactured products that China doesn't actually need, which in many ways was reviving the strategy of the trade war in 2018, so 7 years ago. And the other idea was to try and persuade the other countries of the world, particularly Europe and the global south, the developing world, to decouple from China and to align themselves, more or less exclusively within the United States, with the United States, and to move into the United States sort of economic ecosystem and to be part of its center of gravity. And they've failed on both of those points. But the ambition and the goal of undermining Chinese socialism and undermining China's rise and slowing down China's rise, and ultimately, there's a long-term overall goal of dismantling Chinese socialism and replacing the Communist Party-led government with a comprador government that would go along with the whims and ambitions of US capitalists and potentially break up China into smaller countries that are much easier to control. That ambition hasn't gone away, and I think the real danger is that seeing the failure of the Cold War, the United States will move towards a hot war, and the military component of the US ruling circles will have increasing weight. And that's an area where the United States remains extremely competitive. As I mentioned earlier, the United States maintains 800 overseas military bases. The United States is responsible for over half of the world's military spending. It spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. It's got near monopoly in nuclear power. It has deployment of weapons, and including sophisticated and nuclear-enabled weapons around the world, including in China's locality. So I think it's a serious worry that the United States will attempt to draw China into a war, most likely over the status of Taiwan, and that's something that we have to be very careful about going forward. In relation to the future of socialism, it's a very big question that I'm really not qualified to answer. I think there are some shoots of hope in Europe, very small shoots, and we saw in Britain, where 9 or 10 of our delegates here today come from, some very interesting possibilities in the last few years, particularly with the election of Jeremy Corbyn, who is a socialist and anti-imperialist, to the leadership of the Labour Party in 2015, and he held that position for 2019. And we saw that while he was massively unpopular with the ruling class and with the media, he was massively popular with ordinary people, and particularly young people. And we saw a phenomenon that we literally haven't seen in Britain ever, which is millions of young people getting involved and interested in politics, inspired by politics for the first time, because they saw something in the realm of mainstream politics that they could identify with and that represented their interests, and represented a progressive and a socialist platform, and a platform that was also anti-war, anti-aggression, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist. So this is a new element in the situation, and that's been defeated for the moment, but I think the shoots remain there, and there's possibilities for its growth in the future. In terms of Latin America that you also raised, that's a more positive situation, and I think in countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela and Bolivia, and including in kind of soft left or pink tide countries such as Brazil, the peoples of that part of the world are exploring new paths towards socialism, which don't necessarily look like the Russian Revolution and don't necessarily look like the Chinese Revolution. So they're finding their own 21st century socialism. And it's very difficult to do that because they live in the Western Hemisphere, which is dominated by the United States. However, they do have the benefit of the existence of the People's Republic of China, and this is actually a massive boost to the peoples of the world, especially those countries of the global south that are seeking to find their own development path and to do so whilst maintaining their sovereignty. The existence of a friendly China that is able to provide capital, that is able to invest, and that is able to provide a trading partner and a diplomatic partner. For example, Bolivia under the government of Evo Morales, Bolivia is the poorest country in South America, but under the government of Evo Morales and in conjunction with China and kind of sponsored by China, was able to launch its first satellite, which now provides 4G and telephone connectivity to the whole country. Hugo Chavez, Venezuela's president from 1999 to his death in 2013, was a big friend of China and talked about China and Latin America forming a great wall against imperialism and against hegemonism. And I think that relationship between Latin America and China and the relationship between Africa and China are some of the most important geopolitical relationships in the world, and I think provide great hope for the expansion of multipolarity and socialism.
Great.
Can I make a comment on that? Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of brief comments to regarding the questions that were raised. There's a well-known saying in English called locking the stable door after the horse has bolted, and I think that's very much that's a major aspect of what we're talking about when we talk about Cold War II. I think you have to look at the response of this second Cold War against the backdrop of the development of socialism in China and the development of socialist China over the last decades. In that, as people will know, China began the policy of reform and opening up in 1978. Now, China had a very clear conception of what that process was about, and you can't accuse China of not having explained or tried to explain what it was doing, which was to utilize all positive factors, summing it up very quickly, to utilize all positive factors in order to build China into a powerful modern socialist country. That was the that was the goal of the reform process. It's been immensely successful, but the Western powers, for whatever reason, and I think there were varied reasons, but the Western powers deluded themselves. First of all, they thought that either the start of reform and opening up meant that the Chinese leadership had somehow come to their senses and realized that socialism was a failure and it wasn't a very good system, and that the idea was to go back to capitalism, but they had to keep a bit of Marxist phrasing for window dressing. That was one view. Another view was that China would be inevitably, Chinese socialism would inevitably be swept away by market forces. And that was said by many people in the capitalist class, in the ruling circles of the West, hopefully, and it was said by quite a few of our friends on the left with regret or with anger. But from whatever angle they were coming from, they were proved wrong, and that's, I think, what our delegation has seen this time, is that, of course, in any great historical process, it's not going to be all smooth sailing, and I wouldn't say that, I don't think anyone should say that mistakes have not been made here or there or at this or that time. But the overall policy has been overwhelmingly successful, to the extent that not only has so the Western view was that, like, two things were going to happen. Yes, China would develop a bit, but it would still be basically a low-wage economy, assembling, selling toys, plastic flowers, whatever to the West, and remaining at the low end of the international division of labour, the international value chain, and so on. So on the one hand, and also that the Communist Party would either be overthrown or would somehow change its nature into some sort of moderately social democratic party at best. And particularly in the new era that began in 2012, you see that on both those calculations have been proved fundamentally wrong. First of all, China has become more prosperous, more advanced, more leading the world in technology, research and development, in living standards, in renewable energy and so on. China has become more developed, more advanced than the Western powers ever imagined. And secondly, in doing so, not only has socialism not been overthrown, but China has become more socialist. Professor Zhang's more or less suggested that Carlos work on a new edition of his book. Maybe the other title could be The East is more red, not just still red. So this is the background against which the West has initiated the Second Cold War. And part of the reason why it's so frenzied, if you look at the blizzard of attacks on China coming from the Trump 2.0 administration, the latest one with Rubio saying they're going to aggressively roll back the visas for Chinese students. Not only is it extremely, is it a vicious campaign, it's also ridiculous. You maybe are spared some of this in China, but when we look at the papers and say that you mustn't buy a fridge from China, well, it's not actually that easy to buy a fridge. That's at least part of the components have been made in China, but you mustn't buy a fridge in China because the Chinese Communist Party can spy on you through your fridge. And I want to place it on record that if the Chinese Communist Party wants to spy on my fridge and update my shopping list for me, and even get a Chinese robot to deliver my shopping, I for one would be extremely grateful. It's both vicious and ridiculous, and I think the reason for that is that it has essentially failed, although I do strongly agree with Carlos that the danger is that the Cold War becomes a hot war. But in terms of a Cold War, it's already failed. And if you look at they try to starve China of chips, of microprocessors and so on. And we already see that, you know, Huawei is producing great new phones took the international market and the Western powers by surprise. But I always like to say that, you know, if you look at the 1960s, China was a very poor country at the time. It was not only blockaded by the United States and Western powers, but for other reasons, effectively by the Soviet Union as well. It had gone through a series of natural disasters in the late end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s. The politics of China was in turmoil internally. And yet, in that time, China produced the A-bomb, the H-bomb, launched its first satellite. Now, if China could do that in the conditions of the 1960s, you are really betting against reality to think that you can hold back China by whatever sanctions or tariffs you put on China today. I could say stuff about the Western left and so on, but I've probably taken up a bit too much time. I'm happy to come back to it if time allows.
Yeah, to the audience. 有那个 mic 嘛，这位
Mike?
Thank you so much. Please excuse me if my voice shakes. This is an incredible honor for me to be in China at all. I am Jacqueline Lupan. I'm a member of the Black Alliance for Peace in the United States. Yes, I am from the United States, but not one of them. I consider myself African, and that is the work that we do in the Black Alliance for Peace, because I think I represent a part of the left that is definitely suffering from the sectarianism and the ideological confusion about socialism and communism in China and a lot of other things, including questions of gender and ethnic diversity and racism and these kinds of things. These are things that are serious problems, even among the left in the United States in particular. I cannot speak to the left in the UK, the left in Ireland or other countries, because in the United States, we are isolated from everyone else. And by we, I mean particularly the African American population. We are isolated not just politically, but also economically. We are isolated socially. The indoctrination of Black people in the United States is an indoctrination that is given to everybody, all working class and poor people. But for us, the indoctrination includes another level that convinces us or tries to convince us that the only people who care about us in the world is the United States. And this is the same country that kidnapped our people from the continent, and you know the whole history. So the Black Alliance for Peace is working to raise the consciousness of African Americans, to get us to understand our relationship in our working class and poor neglected communities, and to understand that that's a colonial relationship that we have with the government of the United States. We are not citizens. We're not treated as citizens. We do not have the same rights as other people, regardless of what the Constitution says. And every election with every president, we know that because our rights are always denied, especially in voting. But another thing that is very confusing about our existence in the left, in the United States, and within humanity in particular, is our relationship with Africa. The other thing that we work in the Black Alliance for Peace to educate our people on is that we are African. Regardless of what our relationship is with the United States, we are where we came from. So we are African. And that relationship with the continent is made even more complex when we look at foreign policy of the United States. For example, just a few days ago, U.S. General in charge of AFRICOM, Michael Langley, stated that, in response to the Trump administration's plans to lessen the impact of the U.S. military on the continent, Michael Langley's response was, well, I don't know if we should do that, because if we reduce our control over the African continent through AFRICOM, then that's going to open up these African nations to terrorism and to the influence of China. Because of the anti-Chinese rhetoric that is rampant in the US and the intellectual and ideological dearth of robustness in the United States, a lot of people in the United States believe that 5G gives you brain cancer. So this is what we're talking about here when we're talking about why this propaganda works so well. But among us, we also believe that China is a nefarious, malign actor on the continent. So when we see China engaging with African countries through the Belt and Road Initiative, we African Americans are also suspicious, because we've been indoctrinated to believe that only the US are our friends and the evil Chinese are now trying to colonize Africa. So what would you have me say to our members in the Black Alliance for Peace in response to that claim that China is on the continent to do what the Europeans did? China is not doing anything in Africa to help the people. They are there to exploit, just like the Europeans did. What is your response to that? And why is it important for you to have me tell our people that?
And on this question, in fact, I can give you two cases. You can share this with your friends back home. One is you look at the opinion surveys conducted in Africa, say PW and more. A lot of opinion surveys, including those done by local agencies in Africa. You look for the credible ones which have a good reputation. Virtually, it's almost overwhelmingly positive on Chinese presence. It's so positive, especially in large countries like Nigeria and South Africa and Kenya. So you can check this, even Google them, so this is easy. The second is what China is helping Africa is to rebuild the whole infrastructure. Land, sea, harbor, and air link, airports, and etc. If you have been to 18 African countries, for many decades, if you want to travel from West Africa to East Africa, you go by London or Paris. Because for so many decades and centuries under colonialism, the metropole was London and Paris, so everything goes there. So you go from Ghana to Kenya, you go to London, and then. China said, we help Africa to build a regional network. Roads, sea, river, and air link. So this is socialism, not capitalism. This is socialism, not colonialism. And also the whole idea is based on what we call discussing together, building together, benefiting together. In other words, a country or a company in Africa entirely out of its own interest joins Belt and Road Initiative. China did not impose this on them. So now, maybe, say 10 years back, 5 years back, this kind of slander against China still carry a lot of meaning. But today it's less and less convincing, especially when you encounter those African, West African leaders, whatever. And also, so many people have benefited from the new infrastructure in Africa. So just two simple examples which can help our this story. Yeah. Yes, you please. And next you, okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Santiago Vasquez. I work for a think tank that is focusing on promoting sustainable internationalization in Latin American and Caribbean countries. So first, we are very
You are from which country?
I am from Ecuador, but I am based in Mexico, yes. So first of all, we are very grateful with Progressive International Organization and the local organizers that make us possible to be here in this very important and outstanding dialogue between China and the rest of the world. I have two questions for you, Professor Zhang. The first one is related to your comment on the way that how successfully China has made in order to regulate the financial system. And I think that is so very, very, very key in the process because it has shown very clearly the two differences between the Western-based model, principally led by the City of London and Wall Street, in terms of destroying value, the capacity of production, just on the hands of promoting, speculating, and this hypertrophied financial system and the financialized system that is destroying value, the production capability and the technology development capability in the Western countries. And on the contrary, this magnificent model that has been implemented by China in terms of developing in a sustainable way the production capability, promoting science, promoting the development of technology, that at the end is promoting real value, because the value that China has created is based on production, not based on speculation, financial speculation. That would be my first question. And the second question is related to Latin America. Surprisingly, this way of saying that in Latin America there was a pink tide that I think that is a sort of oversimplifying way of understand how Latin American countries struggled very much at the earliest of this 21st century in order to find our own way to promote sustainable industrialization for the benefit of the population, not the capital. So in that sense, I think that one of the most important things, or the most important shortcomings that we have over there in Latin America, was a lack of sustainable sources of education. Higher and education that is focused and related on national concepts for promoting science, technology. And I don't know what you think in terms of the China Institute, the Fudan University, as part of their expansion, in terms of it will be very much needed in Latin America to at least establish 3 higher universities in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, and Panama, that could help us to strengthen our process of finding our own way to promote well-being and sustainable and green industrialization for our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, concerning this financial system, indeed, it's extremely important to know that the Chinese system is very different from the American system. Again, and our system, under the leadership of the Communist Party, focus on the real economy. That's important. And the United States is a bit worried because at this particular moment today, you have the American system or European system, which is called SWIFT payment system. And there is a Chinese system called the CIPS, China Inter-Country Payment System, whatever, CIPS. Now the point is, the American system is used by most traders, but it's very old-fashioned. It's very costly. You pay 3 or 4%, and it takes 3 days to make one transaction. But the Chinese CIPS is based on blockchain technology, zero cost, virtually, maybe 0.01 something % of the cost. And it's growing steadily and rapidly, because China is the largest trading partner with over 140 countries. So the idea is different. Our system is we break monopoly, we embrace new technologies. So in many ways, in this internet age, AI age, it's competition between 2 models, SWIFT and CIPS, and the Chinese model will win. It's like 2 highways. One is a broken highway, with many traffic still going on. The other is a brand new highway, not much traffic yet, but it will be. Because once you try it even once, you know it's different. It's a game changer. Yeah, this is something the United States is very much concerned with. Yeah. The other thing is, if you look at the Western sanction against Russia, it's a kind of currency war. Basically, Russia can no longer access to any Western currencies. So I was in Russia. I discussed with our Russian colleagues. I said, your approach against this sanction is very innovative. I said the Chinese phrase for currency war, for currency, is made up of two words. One is called goods, the other is called money. So one character is goods, and the other character is money, goods, money, which means currency. So I said Russia has intelligently made this war from a currency war into a war between goods and money. We have goods, you have money. And that's important. It's a message to everyone, to China as well. So global South have goods, have resources, have manufacturers, have raw materials, have everything. The West has money. So the danger is if you are engaged in this financialization of the economy, you have so much money, but you did not have, as you said, real economy to sustain. That's something we're expecting a devaluation of US dollars worldwide, soon. So this is another message. And also with the rise of China, and Carlos mentioned this, it's a tremendous bonus to the global South. If you look at the financial crisis, the Asian one back in 1997, and then the global one in 2008, especially American financial crisis, many countries simply went broke. But this time, with so many ups and downs in the international financial market, the only country that went 100% bankrupt was Sri Lanka. Even Argentina is not exactly bankrupt. For one thing, it can borrow US dollar from China. We have too much savings in dollars. And so Argentina borrow US dollars from China and pay back US debts. And then pay back Chinese side, Chinese banks, with either Chinese yuan, Chinese currency, or Argentine beef, whatever. As a result, beef price in China went down sharply in China. We're happy about it. So there is deals among the global South. We can do that. A swap currency, and so China signed the agreement with swap currency trade with many, maybe over 40 countries or 50 countries. This is also something new and different. But with a real economy and with a financial system that focus on serving the real economy, that's the Chinese approach, socialist approach. As for this educational system, I think, indeed, China is doing well in that because beginning from 1949, when New China was founded, focus of Chinese educational system has always been on hard sciences. So even today, if you go to any high school in China, in Shanghai or elsewhere, the best minds usually prefer to study STEM, hard sciences. So this is a tradition is there. As a result, every year, given the size of Chinese population, we produce more engineers and scientists than the Western countries combined. So this is the power of socialism. We have what they call the bonus, benefit of the engineer bonus, whatever you call it. For instance, BYD, automobile company, wants to hire 1,000 engineers and technicians, and so they can hire them within 1 week. It's done. No other country can do that. So I noticed in China-African summit, both sides signed a lot of communications, very down to earth, including, I don't remember exact numbers, how many students will come to China to study hard sciences, and how many technical training centers will be built by China in African countries. Very down to earth, both theoretical study and hands-on technical trainings. I assume now we have this regular annual or biannual event between China and Latin America. There must be some projects for that. You can just check the communiques on Google, whatever. And there must be certain, because it's all, the Chinese approach is always systematic. You have agriculture, industrial, science, technology, and then AI, whatever, and cultural and other dimensions. So maybe there are some projects for your particular region, your particular country. If not, then you raise them and try to put them into, Chinese being socialists, we love strategic planning. You put this into plan, then it will be carried out, that's for sure. Yeah. The plan, but if you look at the government work report by Chinese Prime Minister every year February, and compare this with the State of Union address of the US President, you will see the difference. One is very down to earth, yeah. Last year we made 50 promises, commitments, and how many were fulfilled? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many not yet fulfilled? It's list. And for the US, it's a campaign address. And people forget next day. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Russell Harlan. I come from Belfast, Ireland. I currently live
Belfast.
in London. I have academic background with human rights. I currently work as a trade unionist in a very conservative part of England. And I just want to make some points on the question about the future of socialism in the West and the left. I think, given the dialogue that we're having and also the work that Friends of Socialist China does, and also the delegations and the dialogues, and I think one of the most important things is for this kind of work to continue, because many of us who are working on the front line of the class struggle, whether that's in the trade union movement or other comrades in America or in Britain, in different kind of movements, we need to be equipped with the knowledge and have the support to challenge the slanders against China, because we are literally fighting for our lives. And we've all become students of Chinese socialism and Chinese revolutionary history, and we find it incredibly inspiring. And it's brought to life this 51-year-old, and I feel like a 25-year-old when I come to China and I learn about the history. But I just want to give one anecdote of the kind of work that I do, and I know my other comrades do. In a recent event I was organising for my trade union branch, living through the normalisation of genocide, I was doing it with a Muslim colleague who wears a hijab. And she made a flippant comment about Xinjiang, and I challenged her straight away, and challenged her with facts and also information about the successes of China. She doubled down and said about that her friend from Xinjiang had to leave and move to France, which I retorted, that bastion of Muslim rights in France. And she said, well, I just don't trust the Chinese government. And I said, well, I'm not sure they trust you given the tale that you just told. But that's the kind of challenge that we're doing on the front line. So, I hope these dialogues, these delegations continue, because our work will continue on the front line of the class struggle. Thank you.
I spent almost 20 years in Europe, and mainly in Geneva, and also in France, in Germany. I've been to Northern Ireland as well. And, as you know, China is always criticized, slandered in the Western media. I do my best to explain. Then, very often, we feel a bit frustrated. So what I will say is, well, I've already explained this twice, 3 times. So, That's the end of it. I leave you in darkness if you don't believe. We don't care. That's it. Indeed. Well, you can't do much about it. You know, in China we see you cannot wake up someone who does not want to wake up. You know, so they prefer to live in dark. And I said, you are going to regret yourself because you don't understand the world's largest economy, the world's largest market, the country in the cutting edge of the AI technology. You miss all that. So I really feel pity for you. You just laugh at them, ridicule them, and then that's one way to after you state facts, then you play up Scottish whatever humor, Irish humor. That will work. Yes, please. 那个给后边一个 next, yes.
I've really been enjoying this discussion. There's been some really great discussions I think we'll all be able to take home from this. I just wanted to touch on the point about, to so many people in the West, the idea of the whole process, people's democracy, is so unfathomable. For a lot of people in the West, including diaspora from African and Asian, Caribbean communities, the only sort of understanding of democracy or the only idea of democracy they think can work and can exist is the one that's used in the West, the liberal procedural democracy, where people vote once every few years for a government that may or may not do anything for them. So I was wondering, from the Chinese perspective, if you could explain, I guess, why the Western style model of democracy just simply wouldn't work in China, and perhaps give some examples of how whole process people's democracy actually works to benefit the people here on a systemic level. And also, sorry, this is kind of a three-part, but in terms of the one China policy as well, how that fits into the whole process. That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
No, because the Western paradigm for political analysis and for its democracy narrative is essentially the paradigm of democracy versus autocracy. And democracy is defined by the West. In many ways, unfortunately, because this term, democracy, so to speak, is registered first, as if it's a patent, by the West. So whatever you talk about democracy, most people, especially in the West, even in the non-Western countries, understand it as a procedural democracy. Universal suffrage, one person, one vote, multi-party system. So I said we need to have a paradigm shift. I said rather than democracy versus autocracy, let's have a new paradigm. It's about good governance versus bad governance. Then I'm being challenged. You have no courage to discuss democracy. No, I said very simple. Because if you divide democracy into procedural democracy and substantive democracy, then I said good governance is the very end of democracy, democracy in substance. In other words, the Chinese approach is we first try to achieve the very purpose of democracy substance, that is good governance. And from that objective, we try to explore procedures appropriate to the Chinese conditions, historical traditions. For instance, in the West, democracy is simply about election. We think it's a very, very rudimentary, and it must be something far more sophisticated. Yeah. And so I said, in the case of China, our approach is selection plus election. Selection first. You have to go through so many, whatever tests. You have governed in 100 million people, whatever, and performed well before you can be selected, and then election. So which approach is better? With all my Chinese modesty, the Chinese doing slightly better, or very much better, depending on your judgment. If you look at the performance, the Chinese system has done so better. Now, consider the whole process democracy, but it's a large, big concept. I'll give you an example to see how China works. Because it had to do with for instance, how to create or build a legal framework, say legislation. How can we adopt a new law? In the West, foreign in the United States, it's about the US Congress. And usually it's lobby groups and the influence congressmen and senators. In the end, one particular law was adopted. As a result, if you look at the Obama's medical bill, whatever, it's thousands of pages, thick. And it cannot work, because it contains all kinds of vested interests and loopholes. In the end, you find it's not implementable. The Chinese approach is a whole process democracy. From day one, from the very early time, when very first draft of the law, it must be sent to one of these, what we call how to translate, grassroots legal center. This is not a good translation, but roughly. In China, we have hundreds of this. For instance, I give an example. There is a law called the Law Against Family Violence. And that was sent to Shanghai, one of these centers. They have established practices. They have hundreds of people who are surveyed. The first draft was handed to them literally. They must give comments. And the People's Congress in Beijing said we need the original comments, not censored, original, whatever they say. Yeah. In the end, because we made a field study to this center, not far from here, I said that in this particular legislation, whether your comments have been reflected in the final version of this particular law. They said that in several areas, for instance, one example is in the first draft of this law, there are only cases which involves husband against wife. And then in one particular comment, which is adopted, it's called there are also cases where the young, some violence against the elderly. So this is also now part of the law against family violence. So from the very first draft to second draft to third draft to its adoption and to its implementation, every year there will be people from People's Congress to examine whether this law has been implemented or not. Yeah. There are so many, for instance, because China is way ahead of many other countries in e-commerce. You can buy everything online from your smartphone. So there is a controversy over if you happen to buy some shoddy products, whether the platform, say Taobao or will be responsible for or not. So there is a particular law on that as well. And again, this particular draft was sent to the grassroots center for review. And then the idea was adopted. That is, after, I don't know, certain amount of complaints from the customers, the platform will have the responsibility to at least know the exact address, name, owner of this company, and then to prepare for possible investigation. In other words, within the platform itself, they have to know the exact dates, the exact data, etc. So this is very down to earth. It's not something abstract. It's very down to earth. Same with the government work report. It's not legislation. Chinese Premier delivers a report at the begining of the session of the People's Congress, and there'll be discussions. Very often there'll be about 100 something sports of revisions. Because in Chinese government work report, each line related to the life of millions of people. You know, it's not. It's something very substantive. You know. I'll just give you some examples to show this. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Oh, yes. You are next. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Miriam. I am from Friends of Socialist China and co-founder of Black Liberation Alliance. I live in London, but I also do a lot of work in Senegal, where I'm from. I wanted to touch on China-Africa relation. We have seen last September at the Forum on China-Africa relation, where new deals has been founded, but we have seen also new ways of African leaders, how they are welcome, respected, and great conversation have come out of it. But also for the women's side of that, because for example, Senegal First Lady have had a meeting with Xi Jinping's wife, and they had a conversation to come up with new ways of supporting girls across Africa. What Africa-China relation does is give us a new ways of 50-50 win-win. Give us new ways of emerging African countries that kind of trying to get in the way of the chokehold of imperialism, whether it's French imperialism or American imperialism. The Sahel region, we have seen how they've been working, cooperating with China from the building of the in Burkina Faso, the hospital being built, and medical training being given by Chinese doctors to African doctors. We have seen also how in Senegal, for example, my country, there is traditional Chinese medicine being taught to our doctors now. What we see is China giving an alternative and giving us the blueprint for countries that want to come out of neocolonialism and imperialism for centuries, and we are seeing that happening at the moment. Also, what we are witnessing right now is a way to come out of the chokehold of the IMF, because not only we are being, there is neocolonialism, but IMF is one of the biggest entities being used by empire, by America to keep the chokehold they have on Africa and the global South countries. After that, my question is, what is the answer to, when we look at Africa and China relation, where we are struggling, I think, is now getting the consciousness of the people, because the Chinese Revolution, you didn't get just here by the Communist Party, but the consciousness also of the people, the work the Communist Party have done to make the people be conscious and emerge and being part of this process. What is the role of Africa now to getting the people involved through that process for liberation and for cooperation of our countries? Thank you.
This is a very interesting question, because I was in Zimbabwe and South Africa last December. It's a conference with participation of many left from African countries. And literally, they said, Chinese policy is non-interference in internal affairs of other countries. But many of them said, we hope you will intervene. Because Americans intervene all the time. So this is something new for China to explore. And indeed, as China itself has so many interests, so many projects in Africa, in Latin America, in other countries, we need some innovative approach. And for China, Pakistan, we're trying out something innovative. So these are but it's always in collaboration, cooperation with our partners in that particular country. That's something we can do. And I agree with you, the key difference between Chinese approach to Africa and the Western approach to Africa is Chinese genuinely respect Africa and treat every country as equals. And for 3 decades, China made it very clear that Chinese foreign minister first visit every year is to Africa. So it's always like this. You know. And even a small country, whatever, how small it is, he comes to Beijing, he received this red carpet welcome, same as the American president or Russian president. It's always the same, whatever, you know, ceremonies, etc. And even we have the African summit with Chinese leaders. Xi Jinping meet separately with each African president. Not easy, yeah. But you go to Washington, D.C., whether Donald Trump or Biden, it's a busload. I remember the Kenyan president complaining, it's not the way to treat us, you know, this way. It's a busload, bus in, bus out. So Chinese pay attention to these details. But genuinely, this is a sense of equality is very much strong in the Chinese culture, in Chinese tradition. So we can play up on that and carry forward this kind of spirit. And so I think, you know, between China and Africa, there are a lot of things we can do. But this particular term, revolution, which is very important. So far, you know, China only talk about revolution with those countries whose leadership also talk about revolution. Like ANC, you know, when we had talks with each other, we call each other comrades, you know. And then with, say, in Southern Africa, China helped set up 6 or 7 party schools for local left-leaning political parties. These are very positive. But as you know, the situation in Africa, as with other countries, are very complicated. And China itself has suffered from that. You know, when the Soviet Union said, we support your revolution, in the end, you know, too much control by the Soviet Communist Party over the Chinese Communist Party. So Mao had a lot of grudges against Joseph Stalin because of that. The Communist Party of China was almost dismantled by the Chiang Kai-shek KMT forces. And so China always say the best experience China has is to seek your own way to success in the light of your own national conditions. And Chinese model, Chinese experience is only for your reference. And also, if it's open, you know, dialogue between China and your particular Senegal, whatever, in support of the revolution in Senegal, it may cause problems for you as well. Yeah. So Chinese are very cautious on that. So at least up to now, we say we respect sovereignty, every nation, non-interference, each other's internal affairs. But we'll discuss that if you said, we welcome China to intervene from your government. Yes. Who else? Yes.
Hello, my name is Richie, and I'm from the United States, but similar to others here, I don't consider myself of the United States and consider myself Mexican, which is where my family is from. But I want to preface my question by stating that I'm a huge supporter of China. In fact, the organizations that I'm a part of in the United States, we prioritize fighting propaganda against China. And we enter into a lot of arguments with the left, as you mentioned, which is largely anti-China. That's just the reality of the situation. One of the latest narratives that has permeated the left in the United States against China is the idea that China has a trading relationship with the state of Israel, and that China is the #1 trading partner of the state of Israel. And at a time when the left is calling for, you know, a breaking of ties with Israel, isolation of Israel, this narrative is very effective. It's, you know, it's I have my own response to that, which I give every single day when leftists and anti-imperialists, which I think are coming from a really good place, have these critiques of China. And I would like you to help me help China. How do I respond to this? I have my own response, but I would love to hear your perspective on this. Thank you.
You know, the Chinese approach to diplomacy is on the whole very cautious. And China itself is willing to be friend with everyone. So long as this particular country is friendly towards China. So we base our relations on mutual respect and friendship between peoples. And even for Israel, because China did not have diplomatic tie with Israel for many decades, but later in the, I think, early 1990s, something, conditions became mature, and there were a lot of, development, and China was open to outside world, to the West, to everyone. So we base this on the UN Charter, respect for sovereignty, and you can be mature friendship, and you can be normal state-to-state relations, and Deng Xiaoping famous said we should be friends with everyone, but he said in Chinese, 我们要心中有数, which means you know exactly who they are. Yeah, you're friend with everyone, but you know who are genuine friends, but not that genuine. So we carried out this relation with on a case-by-case studies, but we're not that immature in the sense if there is one problem of this and that, then you should sanction and then cut off diplomatic relations. Because we see things more in the long-term picture. I'm pretty sure in due course, because this particular regime in Israel is headstrong, and it will be for a while. But in the end, as Chinese with the Philippines and with other countries with troubles, we think in long-term vision, this relation could be ups and downs, but it will be over. In the end, the friendship between two peoples will be there. And I'm pretty sure, in the end, this Middle East peace requires Chinese mediation. And China has set up this international organization for mediation in Hong Kong. Over 60 countries joined, which will play a very important role. So at time of crisis, you do need honest broker. You do need, sometimes it's very important to have someone who can talk to them, really, rather than just to be aloof and to show I'm correct, I'm 100% right. It's not best way. We have to be more sophisticated. At least very few Arab countries criticize China for that. Maybe they think China can play a certain role over there. And even at some critical time, this kind of role is very important. So China is really, in this way, is a very, what's called non-aligned country, and neutral, and plays its own diplomatic role, sometimes very important. Let's have maybe one last question from the audience. Yes, please. Yes.
My name is Korean. I live in the United States, but I was born in China, in Fudan. One of my questions kind of related to yours. One of the common criticisms of China from the Western left is that it's not sufficiently internationalist, and many Western leftists are skeptical of Chinese socialism because it doesn't resemble the more visceral internationalism of the Mao era, for example. But I think for me, this delegation's really underscored how China's self-liberation has not just been a boon for Chinese people, but shifted the worldwide composition of power towards the global south, as you also said in your previous comments. China's interior development goes hand in hand with an external policy of peace, which I think is really underrated in Western analyses of China. And I think that the Western left's assertion that China's imperialist is ridiculous because as you said, it undercuts the basis of US-led imperialism, which is war and financialization. I was wondering if you could maybe provide just a few brief comments about how Chinese national development is transmuted into internationalism and increases the capacity to do more elsewhere. Thank you.
And I'm being one of those who have experienced a bit the Cultural Revolution. And at that time, China supported each and every communist movement. In part because at that time, socialist camp was split, even among the left, among the communist parties. In each and every country, those support China, those support Russia, Soviet Union. And China was so vulnerable because faced with two superpowers, Soviet Union and United States. So China supported so many communist movements in order to reduce pressure from the two superpowers. So when Deng Xiaoping began his reform and opening up, China suspended the support for communist movements and started to have a diplomatic relations with each and every nations. But China also made very sure that China had never openly said we do not support communist movements. I was involved, for instance, in Burma. I was in Burma in 1985, and the Chinese delegation said we're not going to support anymore the Burmese Communist Party, but we're not say this in public. Yeah. This is also very important. In other words, in the end, we find there are so many different Communist Party movements, which drew also lessons from Chinese revolutionary experience. We received support from the Soviet Communist Party. And the point is, Joseph Stalin was being too much interventionist. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party suffered a lot. For instance, in 1927, there was a massacre from KMT against Communist Party of China. But even by the end of 1926, Stalin said you should have collaboration with KMT. Why? Because from Stalin's analysis, China was a feudalistic country. So Chiang Kai-shek represents bourgeois. So bourgeois in the feudalistic society is a progressive class. Of course, in the end, we also realized for the Soviet interest, Russian interest, national interest as well. Yeah, they want to have more collaboration with the nationalist government. So as a result, again, you remember Chinese Communist Party have this Red Long March. It's also had to do with the obeying the order from the Kuomintang in Moscow, because they prefer class struggle in the cities, not in the countryside. Mao was considered a rebel communist. It's almost like Tito, Stalin not happy with that. Again, so Communist Party of China lost all its military forces and began this big retreat. So it suffered a lot from intervention from foreign communist parties. So in the end, Deng Xiaoping came to the conclusion, and Chairman Mao came to the conclusion as well. China must be very independent. We only listen to Soviet Union, other countries as reference, but we adopt independent approach. And in the end, this proved to be correct. And we draw a lot of lessons from the Soviet Union. For instance, even today, we use 5-year plans, which is something China learned from Soviet Union. But we adapt to China's new situation. In the Soviet Union, this 5-year plan was a mandatory planning. How many shoes a factory will produce per year? Now we realize this is stupid. We have the strategic planning. So next 5 years, EV or AI will be our priorities. This kind of planning, that's very important. Same with people's dictatorship, with democratic centralism. We adapt them to Chinese conditions. They prove to be very, very good. Just let you know, next month we're going to Moscow to attend a forum on Russia 2050. They are going to produce a long-term plan, 25-year plans. I'm glad about that, but I'm going there to share Chinese experience. We learned from Soviet Union, and they abandoned Soviet Union, and we carry forward. Now it's a successful case. In other words, we have to be innovative in thinking in new terms about internationalism. We have moral support for sure, but for other supports, we have to be careful, especially really in the light of the condition of that particular country. So that will be a more sophisticated way to approach this whole issue of internationalism. Thank you very much.